On a chilly autumn morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, casting a golden hue across the sprawling estate of billionaire James Sinclair, an unexpected sound disrupted the tranquility. It wasn't the hum of the gardener's leaf blowers or the soft chatter of the household staff preparing for the day. It was a faint, high-pitched cry, almost swallowed by the wind. James had just settled into his usual spot by the window, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. For a man known for his ruthless business acumen and an empire that stretched across continents, mornings like this were rare moments of peace. His estate, hidden deep within acres of lush greenery, was his sanctuary, far removed from the chaos of boardrooms and flashing cameras. The cry came again, pulling his attention. It was unmistakable now, piercing and urgent. Frowning, James set his cup down and walked to the door, his polished Italian loafers clicking against the marble floors. By the time he reached the massive oak doors, his butler, Harris, was already there, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "Sir," Harris began, opening the door slightly. "There's something you should see." James stepped forward, and his eyes immediately fell to a wicker basket placed squarely on the doorstep. Inside, swaddled in soft blankets, were two tiny infants, identical twins. Their small faces were red from the cold, and they squirmed restlessly, their cries now softer, almost as if they knew they were safe. James stared, his mind racing. Who would abandon children like this? And why here, at his home? A note pinned to the blanket caught his eye. He bent down, picking it up with careful hands. The handwriting was shaky, the words hurriedly scrawled. "Please protect them. You're their only hope." Harris hovered nearby, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betraying his unease. "What should we do, sir? Should I call the authorities?" James hesitated. The billionaire was not a man who believed in fate or coincidences, but this situation felt oddly personal. He looked back at the twins, their tiny hands clutching at the air, and something stirred within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. "Not yet," he said finally, his voice firm. "Bring them inside. We need to figure out who they are and why they're here." The staff moved quickly, setting up a makeshift nursery in one of the guest rooms. James couldn't take his eyes off the twins, their presence a stark contrast to the cold, calculated world he inhabited. Questions swirled in his mind. Who were their parents? Why had they chosen him, of all people, to care for these children? Days turned into weeks, and as James delved deeper into the mystery, the twins, now named Ethan and Emma, began to feel like more than just a responsibility. They brought a warmth into his life he hadn't realized he was missing. Their giggles filled the halls, and their tiny hands reaching for him softened the hard edges of his heart. But the mystery of their arrival never faded. Every night, as James stood by their cribs watching them sleep, he felt the weight of the note's words pressing on him. "You're their only hope." What kind of danger were they in? And why was he the one entrusted with their safety? Years passed, and Ethan and Emma grew into bright, curious children, their bond with James unbreakable. He raised them as his own, teaching them values of resilience and kindness, shielding them from the media and the prying eyes of the outside world. To them, he was simply Dad, and the mystery of their origins became a distant question until the day a stranger appeared. It was another crisp autumn morning, eerily similar to the one years ago when the twins first arrived. James was in his study, reviewing documents, when Harris entered, his face pale. "Sir," he said quietly, "there's someone at the gate. He says he has answers about Ethan and Emma." James froze, the words slicing through him like ice. He had always known this day might come, but he wasn't prepared for it. Who was this stranger? What did he want? And more importantly, what secrets was he about to unravel about the twins' past? The weight of the unknown loomed heavy as James stood, straightened his tie, and prepared to face the man who might hold the key to everything. James took a deep breath as he approached the main gate, the steady crunch of gravel under his polished shoes echoing his growing apprehension. The security cameras showed the figure of a man standing just beyond the wrought iron gates. He was tall, cloaked in a dark coat, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hat. In his hand, he clutched a leather briefcase, worn and battered, as though it had seen decades of travel. Harris stayed a few steps behind, his usual stoic demeanor giving way to visible unease. "Should I call the authorities, sir?" he asked softly, his voice a whisper. James shook his head. "Not yet. Let's see what he has to say." He motioned for the gate to be opened, his chest tightening as the heavy iron swung outward with a groan. The stranger stepped forward, his movements deliberate but non-threatening. His hat lifted slightly, revealing a lined face with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through James. Despite his weathered appearance, there was an air of authority about him, as though he carried secrets that could change lives with a single word. "Mr. Sinclair," the man began, his voice gravelly but measured. "My name is Victor Hayes. I believe you've been caring for 2 children, Ethan and Emma." James tensed at the sound of their names spoken by this unfamiliar man. His protective instincts surged, but he kept his composure. "I have. And who exactly are you?" Victor's gaze didn't waver. "I'm someone who knows where they came from, and why they were left on your doorstep." The words hung in the air like an electric charge. James clenched his jaw, his mind racing. For years, he had tried to uncover the truth, hiring private investigators and scouring every lead, but all trails had gone cold. And now, this stranger appeared out of nowhere, claiming to have the answers he'd sought for so long. "I'm going to need more than vague statements," James said, his tone firm. "If you want me to listen, start talking. And make it good." Victor nodded, his lips tightening as if weighing his next words carefully. "I understand your skepticism, but I can't explain everything out here. This is delicate information. It concerns powerful people, people who wouldn't hesitate to harm you, or the children, if they knew what I was about to reveal." The mention of danger made James's pulse quicken. He glanced back at the house, where Ethan and Emma were likely playing or reading, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beyond the gate. "Fine," James said, his voice clipped. "You have 5 minutes. Harris, stay close." He led Victor into the study, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. The man placed his briefcase on the polished mahogany desk and clicked it open. Inside were stacks of papers, photographs, and what appeared to be old legal documents. Victor pulled out a photo and handed it to James. "This is their mother," he said. James stared at the image. A young woman, no older than her early 20s, smiled faintly at the camera. Her features were strikingly similar to Ethan and Emma's, the same sharp cheekbones, the same deep-set eyes. But her face was shadowed by an unmistakable sadness, as if she carried a burden far too heavy for someone her age. Her name was Lydia. She was involved with people she shouldn't have been, Victor continued, his voice softening. She made a mistake, a costly one, and when she realized the danger she'd put herself and her children in, she did the only thing she could to protect them. James's grip on the photo tightened. What kind of danger? Who were these people? Victor hesitated, glancing toward the window, as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Lydia was connected to a powerful organization. They operate in the shadows, manipulating wealth and influence for their own gain. She became a threat to them when she tried to break away. James frowned, his skepticism returning. Why would they care about 2 infants? They're just children. Victor shook his head. It's not about the children themselves. It's about what they represent. Lydia had evidence, proof of the organization's dealings. She'd hid it somewhere, and they believe it's tied to the twins. That's why she left them with you, someone untouchable in their world. She knew they wouldn't risk crossing you. James's chest tightened. It all sounded like something out of a crime novel, but there was a sincerity in Victor's voice that was hard to ignore. "And how do you fit into this?" "I was close to Lydia," Victor admitted, his voice faltering for the first time. "I tried to help her, but by the time I realized the depth of her trouble, It was too late. She disappeared shortly after leaving the twins with you. I've spent years tracking down the pieces of her story, and every trail has led me here. James's mind churned, the weight of Victor's words sinking in. If what he was saying was true, Ethan and Emma were in more danger than he had ever imagined. But there was still so much he didn't understand. Why him? Why had Lydia chosen his doorstep out of all the places she could have gone? Before he could ask, the sound of laughter drifted down the hall. Ethan and Emma, their voices light and carefree, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding just a few doors away. James turned back to Victor, his expression hardening. If what you're saying is true, then what's next? What do they want? And how do I keep the twins safe? Victor's eyes darkened, the weight of his own knowledge evident. That's why I'm here. They're getting closer. I intercepted a message a few weeks ago. They found a lead, a name connected to you. It's only a matter of time before they come knocking. James's jaw clenched. He had built his life around control, ensuring that nothing and no one could threaten his carefully constructed world. But now that illusion was crumbling, and the stakes were higher than ever. I'll protect them, James said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Whatever it takes. Victor nodded, but his expression remained grim. It won't be easy. These people, they don't play by the rules. You'll have to be ready for anything. As Victor gathered his papers and prepared to leave, James felt the weight of a decision pressing down on him. The twins had brought so much joy into his life, but they had also brought a mystery that now threatened to upend everything. He watched as Victor disappeared down the driveway, his figure swallowed by the shadows of the encroaching evening. James stood alone in the study, the photograph of Lydia still clutched in his hand. He knew this was only the beginning. The answers he sought were closer than ever, but so were the dangers that came with them. And as much as he wanted to shield Ethan and Emma from the truth, he realized that the time for secrets was running out. As the night deepened, James found himself unable to sleep. The photograph of Lydia lay on his desk, staring back at him like a ghost from the past. He tried to piece together the fragments of what Victor had told him, but the picture was still incomplete. The twins were asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. He envied their innocence but knew it wouldn't last forever. The next morning, James's routine was shattered once again. Over breakfast, Ethan and Emma seemed their usual cheerful selves, laughing and joking with each other as the sunlight streamed through the dining room windows. But James couldn't shake the weight of what he'd learned. Every laugh, every smile felt like a reminder of how fragile their happiness truly was. "Dad." Emma's voice broke through his thoughts. She tilted her head, her bright eyes filled with curiosity. "Why do you look so serious?" James forced a smile, ruffling her hair. "Just thinking about work, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." But Ethan, always the more observant of the two, frowned. "Is someone bothering you? You've been acting weird since yesterday." James hesitated, his mind racing for a response. He had always been honest with the twins, but this was a truth he couldn't share. Not yet. "I'm fine," he said finally. "Just a lot on my mind. You two go get ready for your lessons." As they ran off, their laughter echoing down the hall, James felt a pang of guilt. He hated keeping secrets from them, but how could he explain something he barely understood himself? He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Later that day, James made a call to an old friend, Sarah Myers, a private investigator who had helped him in the past. She was sharp, discreet, and relentless, exactly the kind of person he needed right now. Within hours, she arrived at the estate, her no-nonsense demeanor a stark contrast to the opulence around her. "You're in deep, aren't you?" she said, dropping her bag on the desk as she scanned the photograph of Lydia. "This isn't your usual business trouble." James nodded, explaining everything Victor had told him. Sarah listened intently, her sharp eyes narrowing as she processed the information. "Powerful organization, hidden evidence, mysterious stranger. Sounds like a bad thriller," she said, leaning back in her chair. But if Victor's right, this isn't something to take lightly. If these people think the twins are the key to finding whatever Lydia hid, they won't stop until they get what they want. James clenched his fists. Then we need to find it first. Whatever Lydia was protecting, it's the only leverage we have. Sarah smirked. Now you're speaking my language. I'll start with Lydia, her connections, her movements before she disappeared. If there's a trail, I'll find it. As Sarah began her investigation, life at the estate carried on, though a subtle tension hung in the air. James couldn't help but notice small, unsettling details. A black car parked just down the road for hours, unfamiliar faces lingering near the gates. Were these coincidences, or was Victor right about the danger closing in? Meanwhile, the twins began to sense that something was amiss. Emma, ever curious, started asking more questions, her young mind piecing together fragments of conversations she wasn't meant to overhear. Ethan, on the other hand, grew more protective, sticking close to his sister and watching their surroundings with a sharpness beyond his years. "Dad," Ethan said one evening as James tucked him into bed, "if something's wrong, you can tell us. We're not little kids anymore." James hesitated, his heart aching at the weight in his son's voice. "I know, buddy," he said softly. "But some things, they're not easy to explain. Just know that I'm doing everything I can to keep you and Emma safe." Ethan nodded, though his eyes betrayed his lingering doubt. "Okay, but if you ever need help, we're here." James smiled, brushing a hand through Ethan's hair. "I'll remember that." The next morning, Sarah returned with new information. She had traced Lydia's last known location to a small, secluded town 3 hours away. There she had rented a cabin under an assumed name just weeks before leaving the twins at James's doorstep. "There's more," Sarah said, spreading out a series of documents on the desk. "Lydia didn't just vanish, she was running. These bank withdrawals, fake IDs, she was planning an escape. And this," she pointed to a crumpled receipt. "A safety deposit box rented under her alias. It's still active." James stared at the documents, his mind racing. "Do you think that's where she hid the evidence?" "It's a strong possibility," Sarah said, "but getting to it won't be easy. If this organization is as dangerous as Victor claims, they'll be watching for any moves like this." James nodded, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew the risks, but he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. "We'll go together," he said. "I'll handle whatever security measures they've put in place." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? This isn't exactly your usual territory." James smirked. "I've faced worse in boardrooms. I'll manage." As they planned their next steps, the tension at the estate grew. James noticed more signs of surveillance, subtle but unmistakable. He doubled security, ensuring the twins were never left alone. But no matter how many precautions he took, the sense of impending danger lingered. One evening, as James reviewed the plan with Sarah, a knock at the door startled them. Harris entered, his face pale. "Sir," he said quietly, "there's someone at the gate. He claims to know Lydia." James exchanged a look with Sarah, his heart pounding. Was this another piece of the puzzle, or a trap set by the organization? Either way, he couldn't ignore it. Taking a deep breath, he stood and prepared to face the unknown once again. James walked to the gate, his chest tightening with each step. The air was sharp and cold, the kind of chill that seemed to settle deep into your bones. Beside him, Sarah moved quietly, her hand resting on the handle of a small concealed weapon. She had insisted on being prepared, and James, though hesitant, hadn't argued. Whoever this man was, he had arrived uninvited, claiming to know a woman whose shadow loomed large over their lives. Trust was not something James could afford to give freely anymore. The man stood on the other side of the gate, his hands shoved into the pockets of a worn trench coat. His face was thin, lined with age and wear, and his eyes carried a haunted look that James recognized from Victor. This was someone who had seen too much, lived too much, and lost more than he cared to admit. "I'm looking for James Sinclair," the man said, his voice rough but steady. I'm James Sinclair, he replied. Who are you, and why are you here? The man shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting briefly toward the house before returning to James. My name is Alan. I worked with Lydia. I know why she left the children with you, and I know what's at stake. James studied him, his mind racing. This was the second time in as many days that someone had appeared claiming to know Lydia and her secrets. It was either an extraordinary coincidence or a calculated move. Either way, he couldn't ignore it. Why should I believe you? James asked, his voice firm but measured. Alan hesitated, then pulled a small envelope from his coat pocket. Because she told me to find you if anything ever happened to her. This was her contingency plan. James took the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, yellowed and creased. It was a handwritten note, the familiar loops and curves of Lydia's writing unmistakable. James, it read, If Alan has come to you, it means I couldn't finish what I started. Trust him. He knows the truth, and he can help you protect them. Please, don't let my mistakes destroy their future. The note ended abruptly, the ink smudged as though it had been written in haste. James's throat tightened as he read and reread the words. They were a plea, a confession, and a warning all rolled into one. Alan watched him carefully. She was trying to do the right thing, he said softly, but she was in too deep. Those people, they don't forgive and they don't forget. They think the kids are the key to finding what she hid, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. James felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, a protective fury that made his decision clear. Come inside, he said, stepping back and motioning for Harris to open the gate. But understand this, if I sense even a hint of a lie, you're gone. Alan nodded, stepping through the gates with the air of a man who had nothing left to lose. Once inside, they returned to the study where Sarah waited, her sharp eyes narrowing as she sized Alan up. Who is he? She asked, her tone suspicious. Someone who claims to have answers, James said, handing her the note. Sarah read it quickly, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Alan. If Lydia trusted you, then start talking. We don't have time for games. Alan sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Lydia was part of a team tasked with covering up the organization's illegal activities. Money laundering, blackmail, even worse things I won't name. She didn't want to be involved, but once you're in, you don't get out. Not alive, anyway. James's stomach churned at the revelation, but he stayed focused. And the twins? Why did she leave them with me? Alan's eyes softened. She was desperate. She knew the organization would come after her, and them. You were her last hope. She knew they'd hesitate to move against someone as powerful as you. But even that wasn't enough. She left behind something, evidence. Proof of everything the organization has done. She believed it was the only way to end it all. Sarah leaned forward. Where is it? Alan hesitated. That's the problem. She never told me exactly. She said the answer would reveal itself when the time was right. All I know is that it's connected to the twins. Something about their birth. She said they were the key. James's mind raced. He thought of every moment he'd spent with Ethan and Emma, every question they'd asked about their mother. Were there clues he'd missed? Pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed. Did they know? Alan asked suddenly. About any of this? No, James said firmly, and I intend to keep it that way. Alan shook his head. You may not have that choice. The organization is already watching you. They're waiting for you to slip up, to lead them to what Lydia hid. If we don't move first, they will. The weight of Alan's words settled over the room like a heavy fog. James looked to Sarah, who nodded grimly. He's right. If this evidence is real, it's the only leverage we have. We need to find it before they do. James's jaw tightened. The stakes had never been higher, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. Ethan and Emma's lives depended on him, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. Then we start tonight, he said, his voice resolute. No more waiting, no more hesitation. We find the evidence, and we end this. But as they began to plan their next move, a shadow loomed over the estate. Somewhere in the distance, headlights flickered through the trees, and James felt the unmistakable weight of being watched. The clock was ticking, and the enemy was closer than ever. The faint glow of headlights outside the estate lingered far too long to be an accident. James stood at the window, his body tense as the distant lights flickered through the trees. He wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. Alan and Sarah noticed his shift in demeanor and followed his gaze, their silence heavy with unspoken fears. "Are they here already?" Alan whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah moved to the security console, her fingers flying across the keys to pull up the surveillance footage. The cameras showed nothing but empty roads and rustling leaves. "Whoever it is, they're keeping their distance," she said, though her tone betrayed her unease. "But it won't stay that way for long." James stepped back from the window, his mind racing. The danger wasn't abstract anymore. It was at his doorstep. He turned to Sarah and Alan, his voice steady but low. "We don't wait for them to make the first move. We need to act now." Before they could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. Harris appeared in the doorway, his normally composed expression rattled. "Sir, there's someone at the service entrance. They're insisting they need to speak with you. They said it's about the twins." James exchanged a glance with Sarah and Alan. His mind screamed caution, but his heart couldn't ignore the urgency. "Bring them here," he said, his voice clipped. Harris nodded and disappeared down the hall. Moments later, he returned with a woman whose presence seemed to fill the room with unease. She was tall and commanding, her sharp features framed by a cascade of dark hair. She carried herself with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. "Who are you?" James asked, his voice cold but curious. "My name is Evelyn," the woman said, her voice smooth and deliberate. "I worked with Lydia. I know what you're trying to do, and I know the danger you're in. But if you want to protect the children, you'll need me." Alan stiffened at her words, his face paling. "Evelyn? No, you can't be here." James's eyes darted between them. "You know her." Alan's voice trembled. "She was one of them. One of the organization's top enforcers. If she's here, it's a trap." Evelyn's expression didn't waver, though a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, crossed her eyes. "I was with them," she admitted, "but not anymore. Lydia brought me into this, just as she'd brought you, Alan. She believed in second chances. She believed in redemption. I didn't understand it then, but I do now." James's jaw clenched as he studied her. Every instinct told him to reject her, to send her away and double his defenses. But something in her tone, her manner, felt sincere. Still, he couldn't let his guard down. "Why should I trust you?" Evelyn stepped closer, pulling a small black flash drive from her pocket and holding it out. "Because Lydia trusted me. This drive contains everything she uncovered: names, accounts, locations. It's what you need to take them down, but it's incomplete. The rest of the data is hidden, and the key to accessing it is tied to the twins." Alan shook his head vehemently. "Don't listen to her. She's manipulating you. She'll lead them straight to us." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "You don't have to believe me, but I'm telling the truth. The organization is already moving against you. They've sent their best operatives, and they won't stop until they have what they want. Without this, you don't stand a chance." James took the flash drive from her, his hand steady despite the storm inside him. He turned to Sarah. "Can you verify this?" Sarah nodded, already pulling her laptop from her bag. "Give me a few minutes." As Sarah worked, the tension in the room thickened. Alan paced near the window, his distrust of Evelyn clear. Evelyn stood firm, her expression unreadable, while James remained rooted to the spot, his thoughts swirling. Finally, Sarah spoke. "It's legit. Bank transactions, confidential communications, incriminating documents. It's all here. But she's right. It's fragmented. Without the rest of the data, we can't make a move." James turned back to Evelyn, his gaze hard. If this is real, why didn't Lydia use it to expose them? Because she couldn't, Evelyn said softly. The full dataset is encrypted. The decryption key is hidden, and the only way to access it is through the twins. Lydia made sure of that. She knew they'd be the safest guardians of her secret. James's heart sank as the implications hit him. Ethan and Emma weren't just targets. They were the centerpiece of a deadly game, pawns in a battle far bigger than any of them. Before he could respond, the estate's security alarms blared, shattering the tense silence. Sarah's eyes darted to the surveillance monitor, and her face went pale. We've got company. Several vehicles approaching fast. James turned to Harris. Get the twins and lock them in the safe room. Now. Harris nodded and bolted from the room, his urgency a stark reminder of the stakes. James grabbed the flash drive, his mind racing. Evelyn, if you're lying. I'm not, she cut him off, her voice fierce. But you don't have time to doubt me. If we don't work together, none of us are making it out of here alive. The sound of tires screeching on the gravel drive sent a shiver down James's spine. The enemy was here, and the battle for the twins, and the truth, was about to begin. The sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel echoed through the estate, growing louder with each passing second. James positioned himself near the entrance, a cold determination settling over him. Sarah stood beside him, her eyes scanning the monitors. Evelyn and Alan, though clearly distrustful of one another, waited tensely in the shadows. Upstairs, Harris secured Ethan and Emma in the safe room, his voice calm despite the urgency in his actions. The first figure appeared in the dim light, clad in black and moving with precision. James could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears, but he didn't waver. He stepped forward, his voice booming. This is private property. Turn around or you'll regret it. The figure paused but didn't retreat. Instead, a distorted voice spoke through an earpiece. We're not here for you, Sinclair. Hand over the children and no one gets hurt. James's grip on the edge of the door tightened. You'll have to go through me first. Before he could respond, Evelyn moved past him, her voice calm but firm. You're wasting time, she said, addressing the figure. Tell your boss I'll handle this personally. If they're smart, they'll let me. The figure hesitated, clearly uncertain. After a moment, a garbled response came through the earpiece. Proceed, but don't fail. James turned to Evelyn, his expression a mix of fury and disbelief. What are you doing? Saving us time, she said. If they think I'm on their side, they won't attack. Yet. But we need to move fast. Alan hissed under his breath. This is exactly why we can't trust her. James ignored him, his focus on Evelyn. If you're lying, I'll make sure you regret it. I'm not, she snapped. Now follow me. Reluctantly, James and Sarah followed Evelyn through a hidden passage that led to the estate's back exit. The twins were waiting there with Harris, their wide eyes betraying their fear. James knelt beside them, his voice gentle. It's going to be okay. We're getting out of here. Evelyn took the lead, guiding them toward a concealed vehicle hidden in the woods. But as they approached, the sound of engines roaring to life cut through the night. James turned to see more vehicles pulling up, blocking their escape route. We're surrounded, Sarah muttered, her hand instinctively reaching for her concealed weapon. Evelyn's face darkened. There's another way, but it's risky. Do we have a choice? James asked. She didn't answer, instead motioning for them to follow her deeper into the woods. The path was uneven, the branches clawing at them as they moved. Behind them, the distant sound of shouting grew louder, the enemy closing in. Finally, they emerged at an old, abandoned shed. Evelyn pushed open the door, revealing a tunnel that sloped downward. This will take us under the estate. We'll come out near the cliffs. Alan looked skeptical. And then what? We just jump. Evelyn shot him a glare. Do you have a better idea? Without waiting for a response, she led the way into the tunnel. James held Ethan and Emma close, their small hands gripping his tightly. The air grew colder as they descended, the walls damp and echoing with their footsteps. When they finally emerged, the cliffs stretched out before them, the moonlight reflecting off the churning sea below. Evelyn pointed to a small boat anchored near the rocks. "That's our escape." Ellen scoffed. "You expect us to trust you and climb into that death trap?" Before Evelyn could respond, a shot rang out, striking the rock beside them. They turned to see several figures advancing, their weapons raised. The group scattered, finding cover behind boulders as the attackers closed in. James felt his pulse racing as he shielded the twins. Sarah returned fire, her movements precise and fearless. Alan, despite his protests, grabbed a loose plank and swung at an approaching figure, knocking them down. Amid the chaos, Evelyn shouted to James, "Take the kids to the boat. Go now." James hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He grabbed Ethan and Emma, sprinting toward the boat as bullets whizzed past. Behind him, he heard Sarah and Evelyn working together to hold off the attackers, that unlikely alliance born out of necessity. When James reached the boat, he helped the twins climb in before turning back. "Sarah, Evelyn, we're ready." Sarah appeared moments later, breathing hard but unharmed. Evelyn followed, her arm bleeding from a shallow graze. They jumped into the boat as James started the engine, the sound of the attackers shouting fading into the distance as they sped away. For a moment, there was silence, the group catching their breath as the boat cut through the dark water. James looked at Evelyn, his voice heavy with suspicion. "You said there was another way. Why didn't you mention the boat before?" Evelyn met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Because I didn't know if you'd trust me enough to use it." James' eyes narrowed. "And should we?" Instead of answering, Evelyn pulled a small device from her pocket, the decryption key. She held it out to him, her voice steady. "This is what Lydia hid. The organization would have destroyed anyone to get it. Now it's in your hands." James took the device, his grip firm. "Why give it to me?" "Because you're the only one who can protect them," Evelyn said, her voice softer now. "Lydia was right to trust you. I see that now." Before James could respond, Sarah spoke. "What happens next?" Evelyn's expression darkened. "They'll come after us. This isn't over. But with this, we have a chance to end it, for good." James looked at the twins, their small faces filled with a mix of fear and trust. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the boat disappeared into the horizon, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him, but he was ready to face it, no matter the cost. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the small boat drifted into a quiet cove, sheltered by towering cliffs and overhanging trees. James cut the engine and allowed the gentle waves to guide them toward a secluded patch of shore. Everyone was silent, exhaustion etched into their faces. Ethan and Emma huddled close to James, their small bodies leaning against his for comfort. He looked down at them, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. They were safe for now. Evelyn jumped out first, securing the boat to a nearby rock. Her movements were deliberate but heavy, her injury clearly slowing her down. Sarah helped her, the tension between them easing in the wake of their shared fight for survival. Alan, who had grown quieter since the escape, lingered at the edge of the boat, staring at the horizon as if searching for answers in the endless expanse of water. "We can't stay here long," Evelyn said, her voice breaking the silence. "They'll track us eventually." James nodded. "But we need time to regroup, to figure out our next move." They made their way up the rocky path, finding refuge in an abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. It was modest and weathered, but it offered a roof and enough space for everyone to rest. Harris, ever the protector, scouted the perimeter before giving James a nod of approval. Inside, James set the twins down on a worn-out sofa and knelt in front of them. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Ethan nodded bravely, though his wide eyes betrayed his fear. Emma clung to his arm, whispering, "Are the bad people gone?" James forced a reassuring smile. "For now. But I promise, no one will hurt you. Not while I'm here. As the twins rested, Sarah began examining the decryption key Evelyn had handed over. Her fingers moved quickly over her laptop as she connected the device and opened the files. Lines of code and documents filled the screen, and her brow furrowed in concentration. "This is it," she said after a while. "Lydia's data, bank accounts, names, operations, everything we need to bring them down." Evelyn leaned against the wall, her face pale but resolute. "We have to be careful. The moment we go public with this, they'll retaliate. We need a plan." James sat down heavily, the weight of the situation pressing on him. "We can't keep running forever. If we want to protect the twins, we have to take the fight to them." Alan, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "It's not just about protecting the twins. It's about justice. Lydia gave her life for this. If we don't act, her sacrifice means nothing." For the first time, there was no animosity in his voice, no suspicion. James nodded in agreement. "Then we do this. Together." The group worked through the day, poring over the files and devising a strategy. They discovered that the organization's power lay not only in its wealth, but in its network of corrupt officials and businesses. But there were weaknesses, holes in their defenses that could be exploited. It would take time and precision, but the data gave them a chance. As evening fell, James stepped outside, the cool air offering a brief reprieve from the intensity of their planning. He stared at fading sunlight, his thoughts drifting to the twins and their future. Evelyn joined him, her footsteps quiet. "You're thinking about what comes next," she said, more a statement than a question. James nodded. "They deserve a normal life. A chance to grow up without looking over their shoulders." "They will," Evelyn said firmly, "but only if we finish this." James looked at her, searching for the truth in her words. Despite everything, he felt a grudging respect for her. She had proven herself, risking her life to protect the twins and deliver Lydia's data. "Why did you really leave the organization?" he asked quietly. Evelyn hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because I couldn't keep lying to myself. Lydia showed me there was another way, a better way. I owe her for that. And now I owe it to those kids to make things right." James nodded, accepting her answer. "We'll finish this, together." Over the next few weeks, the group executed their plan with precision. Using the data, they exposed the organization's secrets to trusted authorities and media outlets, ensuring the information couldn't be buried. They cut off funding streams, dismantled operations, and left the organization scrambling to contain the fallout. But the fight wasn't without its cost. The group remained in hiding, constantly looking over their shoulders as the organization retaliated in desperation. There were close calls, narrow escapes that left them shaken but determined. In the end, the organization's power crumbled under the weight of the exposure. High-ranking members were arrested, and their network unraveled. It wasn't a clean victory, but it was enough to ensure the twins' safety. Months later, James stood on the porch of a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, watching Ethan and Emma play in the yard. Their laughter filled the air, a sound that brought a rare smile to his face. Sarah stepped out to join him, her presence a comforting reminder of how far they had come. "They're happy," she said softly. "They deserve to be," James replied. "And now they can be." Evelyn and Alan had parted ways with the group after the fight, each seeking their own path. Evelyn had promised to keep in touch, though she preferred to stay in the shadows. Alan, ever the idealist, had gone on to advocate for others caught in the organization's web, turning his guilt into action. As for James, he had found peace in the simple life he had built with the twins. They were his family now, a bond forged in the fire of their shared struggles. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he was ready to face it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in a golden glow, James felt a sense of closure. The danger had passed, the ghosts of the past fading into memory. What remained was the promise of a new beginning, a future built on love, trust, and the unshakable belief that, even in the darkest moments, there is always hope.